Welcome back to Big Brave Business. I'm your host, Sarah K. Heater. Big Brave Business is a podcast where we challenge the status quo of traditional business practices. So if you're ready to challenge norms, rewrite the rules, and redefine what it means to lead with courage and integrity, then grab a notebook and let's dive in. Welcome back to Big Brave Business. That was a little different for you guys today. I don't know where it came from. It's just my inspiration. Okay, I'm here today with another guest this week, and I'm so excited to introduce you. Hady is a Latina speaker and ERG coach based in NYC that works with ERGs looking to take their efforts to the next level. She's the founder and CEO of Boldly Speaking, LLC, a company that is transforming the professional experiences of women and people of color by empowering underrepresented employees with the skills to self-advocate, self-promote, and capitalize on leadership roles within employee resource groups and throughout organizations. With a diverse career spanning over 25 years, Hady has served as head of equality for a major tech firm, held multiple customer-facing roles in high-tech and financial services, served as a leader and advisor across various employee resource groups, volunteered as an international champion for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women, and served as community school director at an elementary school in the South Bronx. In her free time, Hady is an amateur street art photographer and an avid podcast listener. Welcome to Big Brave Business.
Thank you for having me, Sarah. I'm happy to be here.
There's so much cool stuff in your bio, but I know the first thing that people listening are probably wondering is, what is an employee resource group? Can we let's start there?
Yes, that's a good question. And I get asked that question all the time. And my most simple answer to that is that it's like a club. So it's a club that is made up of members that share an identity. So it could be a women's ERG made up of women, people who identify as women, or it could be a Black employee resource group made up of employees that identify as Black. And it's so on and so forth. And there could be, I've heard of ERGs from everything from like race, from gender, from sex. So there's usually, most companies have an LGBTQ plus ERG. So that's one. Usually there could be some for like caregivers or parents, people that are neurodiverse or have some other form of maybe some other disability, and they get together to try and educate, inform. Usually the communities or the club is there to build. So it's a community for people to support each other. And it's also meant, usually they'll spend time advocating for themselves and also educating other employees about their specific community. So as a Latina, I've almost always been part of a Latinx ERG, and it's a great place for me to meet people, especially when I join a company. But also it's the place where we celebrate Latinx Heritage Month, or maybe we talk about Latina Equal Pay Day and we advocate for ourselves that way and inform and create awareness with other employees.
Yeah, I feel like this is really important for a sense of community and that feeling of being the only person in the room or the only person at the table is such a common experience for all of the different identities that you were just mentioning as examples. And I'm thinking that just the community part is already such a huge reason why that would be so important. But what are some other reasons why ERGs are important? And I'm curious too, I'm reflecting on my own kind of corporate experience, and I feel like these opportunities were really few and far between at the companies where I worked. So I guess with your experience and what you do, can you shed some insight on what companies, like what environments would this be important? How big of a company would need to have this? And at what point should you start considering? And how do you start them? Like, where do they come from?
Oh, okay. Yep. Lots of great questions. So I'll start off with the first one, which is, besides community, why do they exist? I think I mentioned like advocacy. Maybe a caregiver's ERG is going to focus on employee benefits and say, we need maternity and paternity leave, family leave. We need maybe something for be able to take some time off if we're caring for elder parents or sick family members, something like that. So they might advocate for themselves in that way. There's also, ERGs also create safe spaces. And that's really important for some communities. I could imagine like an LGBTQ plus community really values a safe space, maybe because of many of, or at least some people might not even be out. So it's possible that some people are not out at work, but at least they have this safe space to be with people that share an identity. I think back to the summer of 2020 when George Floyd was murdered. The Black ERG was there to support each other during a crisis, basically. It was a crisis. And I know, like, at that time, I belonged to a company where the entire Black employee resource group was offered counseling. Like, they brought in and they were doing like group counseling for the entire ERG. And it was close, safe space just for that group because of the trauma that people were experiencing and going through, and the feelings, and the like, hard to focus on work when like the world seems to be exploding on the outside. And how do you deal with that? Because like you might enter a space, to your point, where you're the only, so let's say you're the only Black person in your group, and your whole team is talking about the weekend was so much fun, I was golfing and doing things with my family, and I was, maybe as a Black person, I was out protesting all weekend because I needed to be out protesting all weekend. And that takes a toll. And the ERGs at that time were really providing like crisis management and extra support for members during a time when they really needed it. So I would say ERGs offer a multitude of services, if you will. And also they're a great place for allies to learn. So let's say as a white woman, you're like, I want to support my Latina sisters. And we create spaces for you to come and understand how to support us and what are some of the things that we need your support with, as an example. And so it's a good space for allies to come and learn. And lots of allies, they're typically like people leaders, or they could be managers, and it's good for them to come and learn because they have teams, and there might be people with different identities on their team, and that's a great way for them to understand a little bit more what some of the people on their team might be experiencing, and then know how to show up better for them. So those are all the reasons why an ERG might exist, and how it helps employees get that sense of belonging, and how people can show support. In terms of, you said you haven't experienced a lot of ERGs. I have, and it's probably because I was part of big companies. So I worked at a really big like financial services firm. They had ERGs. I was part of a women's ERG 15 years ago, 20 years ago, and I was part of a mentoring program, I remember, a long time ago. I did belong to a small startup ish type of technology company that probably had maybe 3 or 4 thousand employees, and they were just starting their ERG journey. And so when I got there, they had a LGBTQ plus ERG, which was the first one that actually started, and then they had a Black ERG, and they might have had a women's ERG, but they didn't have a Latinx one. So to answer your question about what I did, I went to, I think, the leader of the LGBTQ plus ERG, and I was like, how'd you start? Like, how did you get the group formed? And they were like, oh yeah, here's how you do it. So typically you gotta get a decent number of people together and say, there's 50 of us that want this. So there's an audience for this. And typically also many companies will start you off as like an affinity group. So we're not going to make you an ERG. You're going to graduate into being an ERG. Maybe it'll just be an affinity group, and y'all can get together and see if there's really enough there. And
Wait, what's the difference?
usually affinity groups they don't get budgets. That's the biggest difference. If we're going to, the biggest
Oh,
difference is money. Like if you're an ERG, typically you're going to get an
okay.
annual budget to spend, and you can get speakers and run events and do things, pay for a caterer for an event, hire an external speaker, maybe do professional development for your members, things like that. And so an affinity group might just be people casually getting together. Maybe they'll do virtual Zoom calls, things like that. But once you start getting like in-person events with like food and drink and external people, and there's money involved, usually that's more reserved for a business resource group, or an employee resource group. And so yeah, like I think you got to get your mission together, understand why you're getting together, say here's a group of people, there's a lot of us, we're interested, there's people stepping up to be the leaders of the group, and we're ready for like prime time. And then typically that's a partnership with like HR, or maybe like a director of DEI or somebody like that is usually who runs the ERGs. So you got to like partner with whoever is running them. And any ERG leader could tell you like who their contact is. And that's how who to like approach and say, I want to start an ERG. I don't see one for the veterans, but I'm a veteran, or I'm a spouse of a veteran, or a relative of a veteran. And I want to really focus on that. And then that's how you would start.
Super interesting. So, the first question that's coming to my mind about this, as far as I guess there's two pieces of this for people who are more in leadership roles in a company or they run a company. How could this look first of all, at what point do you start putting these together? If you're building your own business or you're part of business leadership, like at what point of a company size do you think this is important to start taking into consideration for your team? And then also, what could this look like, a version of this, as far as, or what does it look like in an industry, not necessarily at one company, if that makes sense. So like I work in podcast production, so I work in a podcast industry. My company is pretty small. It's very small as far as like scale of companies goes, but there's a lot of other podcast production.
I got you. I'll
So
tell you.
can we
I'll
touch
tell
on
you.
this?
I got answers. You got questions. I got answers. So to answer your first question, how big should the company be, or like what is the impetus for this? I think it really needs to come organically from employees. So whenever employees start asking for it is when you should start to do it. And it could be a smaller size company, maybe a couple hundred people. If employees want to get together and there's enough of a particular identity to get together and start having conversations and safe spaces, if they feel they need the safe space, or they feel they need to advocate for themselves, or they feel whatever, all the things we listed earlier, if they feel there's a need for that, then they'll probably raise it. I know I'm on the board of a nonprofit organization, which is quite small. They're probably not even 100 people all in. And they're starting to think about it because there's people who are asking for it. And like I said, is when people start asking, that's when, and usually once an organization has one, it's now becomes pretty easy because there's like a little recipe for it. So here's the template. Like we started the women's ERG, which is a very common one to start off with, because usually like half of employees could be women. If you're working at a company that's in it, I guess doing a good job of hiring women, let's say half the employees are women, then that might be of where you start, and then other people can go from there. If they're like, I'm a woman, I'm a Latina, but I'm a Latina woman, but I'm a Latina, and I feel like I'm that part of the conversation is missing for me. So I want to get together with other Latinx employees. Then maybe I start my own and then build from there. But usually it is a partnership. So I don't recommend that employees just start underground creating these spaces. Ideally, you should work with your HR team to say, here's a need. I've talked to other people. There's enough of us that we really think we can start something here, and there's going to be value added to the company by doing this. So that's one. The second thing I'll say is your question's a really good one. I'm a solopreneur, and it's where do I find community? Because I also want my own club type of thing. And I'll tell you that I have joined various women professional organizations. I don't know if you've ever heard of Chief, or if you've ever heard of Elevate Network, but they're both professional organizations for women. So that's like my women ERG, and it's made up of like different people. Some of them are business owners, some of them work for like other firms like technology, financial services, healthcare, whatever the case might be. But it's my women's ERG. So we talk about women specific issues, we support women, we're creating safe spaces for women, and that's like a women's ERG, but it's not for one company. It's across the industry, to your point, across many industries. I also belong to a group called Lean In Latina Speakers and Coaches. So that's a space. It's not an ERG, but it's like an ERG. It's like a little club, and it's for Latina women coaches and speakers. And so we get together once a month and we supporting each other. We have some professional development. We have a conference once a year where we get together, and we're like kind of trying to amplify our members and lift people up. And we talk about things like, what should we be charging? If I'm new to the speaker space and I have 20 friends that are already speakers and been doing it for several years, that's a great way for me to get inside information. It's how much should I be charging my first year? And if it's an in-person, is that different from something virtual? If I'm traveling or it's a conference, if it's a panel versus a keynote. And these are people who have the experience and they can guide me. And it's all Latina women. If that's what I'm looking for, then that's the space that's just for me, for people like me, so to speak. And then the other day, I was asked to speak at this event, and this is another professional organization. I'm not part of it, but I'm considering joining it. And it's called 2045 Studio, and it's a space for professionals of color. And so it's made up of men and women, but everyone identifies as a professional of color. And so I just spoke at an event. They had a panel discussion about cultura and career. And I came and I was invited to be a guest speaker. And when I was there, I got a tour and they were like, oh, we have fun things coming up. You should check out the calendar. And I'm like, wow. And the space had like great art, and the art was all by other professionals of color. So, like, even the artwork, the vibe, the energy was all amplifying people of color. And so it's a space where I feel like very welcome and very comfortable and very safe. And so I think that's what's in. So I don't know if you could find one specifically for podcasters, but maybe you should create one if you can't. But I think you could, because there's so many. I'm starting to see so many pop up. And granted, I live in New York City, so there's like a lot of different movements and things. But there really seems to be like, oh, Latinas that are like Gen Z, Latinas that are millennials, Latinas that are in financial services and Gen X and drive Subarus. It feels like there's something for like very particular, but obviously the more intersectionalities you have in common in the group, like then it's like really people like you. And I'm not always an advocate to always surround yourself with people like you, but sometimes it's nice. It's like a balance. Like everything else in life, it's a balance. Sometimes it's really nice to be with people like you, and also it's nice to hear and be around other perspectives.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. All of it's been interesting to me, but I think that specifically one thing that I know from my kind of other life, which is I'm very involved in Girl Scouts of the USA. I have another podcast I've been doing for many years, which is for troop leaders. And one of the things that the research shows us, of course, the research is very gender binary, but the research shows us that girl children thrive in girls only environments. They need to have girls only spaces, and boy children actually thrive in co-ed
Oh, I
spaces.
bet
They
they
need to
do.
have access to co-ed spaces. But that is interesting because obviously we need both, but just in that specific example, and that's really particular to kids as well, although I'm sure it's true for adults, but the research I'm referring to is specific to kids. But I think that is always an interesting kind of thing, because when we talk about like equality, this I'm going to go on the same example because that's where my like most experience is working in this space. But when Boy Scouts a few years back announced that they were going to start accepting girl members in kindergarten through 5th grade, which I don't know if you're not familiar with Girl Scouts as much as me, you may not even know that Boy Scouts started doing this, but they actually changed their name to Scouts BSA instead of Boy Scouts of America. It's Scouts BSA because now they accept girl members. They already did older girl programming a little bit, but they do K-5, which is like the kind of hot spot for that industry. A lot of people were championing that decision from Scouts BSA to be more inclusive of an environment and that this is a progressive step forward. Whereas a lot of people in the Girl Scout community were saying, actually, it really is not a progressive thing. And so I think this is an interesting discussion about the concept of equality, and especially with your experience working in this field and specifically having a role that I think what did I say? You told me it was head of equality for a major tech firm. I'm curious if you have thoughts or if you want to jump in on that kind of line of conversation. Obviously, I'm specifically talking about very limited scope of equality here, but what insights do you want to tap into there?
You made me think of something that's related but not the same, but it is interesting. I think your listeners might find that interesting too. So, I'm also an instructor for I Am Remarkable, and it's a training class that Google actually created. And it's mostly for women and people of color and people from the LGBTQ plus community. So, like underrepresented communities. And it's all about self promotion and why you should self promote. That's essentially I Am Remarkable. So, like at the end, you walk away convinced that you are remarkable and you should be telling the world why you're so remarkable. But in the class, and we have some statistics and studies as well. And one of the studies that you made me think of is that men don't like women who self promote, and women don't like women who self promote. So it's not the same thing, but it made me think of it because it's like, whoa, what? Say that again? Because it's not what you think. And it's, oh, shoot, what is that? So it's like sabotage. So yeah, it's a good thing to know. And that study was done like, I think like 30 or 40 years ago. And then they repeated it after some time. And it was, the numbers were about the same. So it was like the most most, like the majority in a group, if you ask, the majority of men will not like a woman who self promotes, and the majority of women will not like a woman who self promotes either. And so that's part of the reason why a lot of women don't self promote. At the same token, what the class teaches you is that everyone is self promoting. Some people do it more in your face, some people do it more subtly. Obviously, with social media, there's lots of ways to do it. And you not only have to do it during social media, you could do it in person. There's lots of ways to do it. The point is that everyone's doing it, or to the degree that even anybody is doing it, we're really compelled to do it too, because we know that our competition and our peers, they're out there doing it. They're out there saying the things like, "Yeah, here's what I did. I'm excited that I got this new, like, fancy, shiny," let's say they finished a course, or they got a new certification, or they got promoted, or they're working for a new company, or they got a new title, or they got assigned to this new whatever. Everyone's talking about it. And it makes it feel like, if you're not talking about it, that you're not having the same experience. That could not be the case, but that's what it feels like. So that's the real, like, compelling reason why you want to jump in and be building your brand too. It's because other people are doing it, and if you don't do it, it looks like you're not accomplishing a lot of the same things. Whether that's true or not, it's irrelevant. It's just, that's what it's going to look like. Yeah, so I thought it was really interesting, and it's things that you need to know, because I was a missioner. So you mentioned in my bio that I spent some time working overseas with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated women. And what you said also reminds me of that, because lots of times people are like, "Oh, let's go to other countries and do things." And it's, you got to know what you're doing, and you got to know the impact it's going to have. You can't just, like, willy nilly. It might on the surface look like you're helping. And if you're not thoughtful about, like, the from beginning to end, what this thing is the actual impact it will have, it could actually be harmful. And so I definitely learned that. And the best thing you can do when you're, like, in roles like that overseas, or you're in a community that you don't belong to, is to really empower people to do things themselves. That's the best thing you could do. Is you could just be there to be an amplifier, a supporter, someone who's cheering people on, but, like, as much as possible, refrain from centering yourself, because that almost always leads to a bad place.
That actually, I feel like, really comes back to how important it is to have spaces to connect with people with more of a shared identity. And you mentioned the more intersectional it can be, that you share all of these different layers of identity with people in these groups. That can be even more helpful, because it made me think of, while you were talking, I remember, obviously, we've all heard the man versus bear trope going around. Would you rather encounter a man or a
Ay,
bear
ay,
in the
ay.
woods, for women? And one thing that I saw that really impacted me so much more than the man versus bear conversation, because that isn't surprising to me, especially with the work that I do with Girl Scouts and gender. None of that surprised me. But the thing in the discourse that I heard that really hit me the most was hearing women of color express that, "Hey, by the way, white women, you might need to hear this. If the choice was between a white woman and a bear, I would still choose the bear." And I think that's a layer of the conversation that white women really don't want to have, right? Well-meaning white women like myself. And I think that has just really been stuck in my head. And I think with Girl Scouts, it's easy for me to be able to say, looking through a lens of gender, that part of the reason why it's so important for girls to have space without boys, and again, I know this is very binary language, but one of the reasons why it's so important for girls to have space without boys is because they can have an environment that removes that layer of social dynamic, of gender social dynamic, in order for girls to explore, to figure out who they are, who they want to be, to figure out how to establish relationships with each other, with themselves. So it's easy to apply that same logic then across all different layers of our identity, that if spaces are unsafe for us, then we are less likely to be able to become the best, most effective, most accomplished, whatever it is,
Version of ourselves.
version of ourselves.
Yeah,
Exactly.
I'll give you an example. I work for a company, and there, this wasn't a women's ERG, so it was not an example of a women's ERG. It was simply a women's Slack channel. So do you know what Slack channel is? Just a little. It was a group, and anybody could write a comment and anything. So it was a women's channel, and in this channel, it was reserved for women to share things that they experience in the workplace that were like, you're not going to believe what just happened to me. And they would say, can you believe, like, I was there and I said the same thing. And then this guy came and said the same thing. And I said something and then the guy said the same thing. And when he said it, everyone was like, yay. When I said it, like, no one had a reaction type thing. So I was part of this channel, as were other women of color that I know. And at one point, we said, I don't know if y'all know, but there's like a little extra for us. So everything you said, plus this is how we experience it. This thing is called intersectionality because we're women of color and we're women of color. So we have this intersectional thing that makes it even a little bit more hard for us, or a little bit like even more microaggressions type thing. And no one said anything. No one acknowledged it. No one said, I understand. No one said, wow, that's interesting. Never heard of it. No one said anything, like good, bad, or ugly. No one said anything. And like and we tried this like once or twice, and it was like crickets. So then like a couple of us had an offline conversation. We're like, we should just start our own channel for women of color, because that channel ain't it for us. Like it still doesn't feel like we're being heard. So that's what we did. So we started our own channel, and we just had the Women of Color channel. We're like, we're just going there. Like, we'll still be part of this other space and we'll like support those women. But if we need to feel supported, that place ain't it for us. So we're going to have to go to our own channel, and that's where we're going to support each other. And then we started a book club, and we started like it snowballed because we were really like seeing each other, and people were like, wow, I've never been in a space like this before. This is awesome. And people would tell their friends. And as soon as somebody started that was a woman of color, they're like, hey, there's a channel for women of color. I'm going to add you, because it was like a private channel. So
Yeah.
yeah, and it snowballed, and it ended up being a very nice space. And it was just this like little space for us, but it was nice. And we felt valued and appreciated there.
That's great that you were able to create that space, and a shame that a space that seemed like it could have and should have been positive wasn't supportive or fully seeing you for your whole self, your whole person. And I'm curious, and I ask this question acknowledging that you do not have the responsibility to be the ambassador of all women of color telling white women what they could do better, but acknowledging that, what are some ways that those comments in that Slack channel could have been received or acknowledged by the white women in the group that would have felt like a better any response? But what is the response? Because I think that's something that a lot of people in allyship and advocacy struggle with, is like, how do I be a good ally? I want to do it right. What does that look like?
Yeah, and there's some good data also to support that. A lot of white men and women identify as allies, and they're like 80% of us, we're all allies. And then Black and Latinx and other women of color are like, I have no allies in the workplace, or 13%. So it's I forget the exact numbers, but it's a huge gap between people who identify as an ally and people that say they actually experience allyship at work. So it's a big gap. So there is a lot of confusion about what it means to show up as an ally. I would say the most important thing is definitely leaning in with curiosity. I would say that's the best thing you could do. If you don't know, it's okay. You don't have to know, but be curious about it and be like, I never heard of that before. Can you tell me what that means? Or wow, tell me more. Like, what happened? I don't even understand. Say that again, or tell me more about what that experience was like, or anything. Like any kind of question or curiosity, I think is very important. And then I think the expectation is that it's a continuum, but you can't always be like learning. Like you're going to get to the point where you should have some information and understand that this is sometimes it is problematic. Sometimes microaggressions can be quite challenging. There's a lot of things like women of color very often experience this pet to threat phenomenon where they're brought in and everybody loves them and they're like, this is great. Hattie's great. She says it like it is. And she has answers and she digs right in. And then all of a sudden wait a second, it feels like Hattie's coming for my job. So now let's find a way to shut her down. Too much. Now you're too much, Hottie. Stop it. You're being too disruptive. We don't need you to be so aggressive. So it goes all the way from we love it to now it's too much. So there are things like that that are documented that you could ask a lot of women of color. They're like, that sounds like super familiar to me. And so that said, it would be nice also to familiarize yourself with some of those experiences and to seek to understand what some of those experiences are like. And also, I think creating space is very important. I will tell you that I work for a company and we had just created a role within our women's ERG called the intersectionality chair. And it was for amplifying other women in the group and making sure that like we were always bringing in other voices. And the woman who was in that role was a white woman. And once I found out about the role, I was like, I'd like to kind of work with you because I just want to make sure like we have that lens. Because if the idea is really to include women of color and other people, other women, I really think someone in that role should be like, it's for us. Can one of us actually be in the role? And that person was like, you're gonna have to wait till next year. I'm in the role. This is my role. Like I'm in the role. You could wait your turn. And that was like such a classic example of not creating space. Like, okay, you're tone deaf to read the room. Like you missed the whole point of the role. But like that did happen. And I had a very strong reaction to it because I was like, but you're managing how much space we're gonna get instead of allowing us to create space for ourselves. You're still in the power role and you're not sharing your power, you're not sharing the influence. And so that is really important. We consider ourselves peers, so we want also to be in the spaces and to be a part of making decisions and deciding how we're going to show up for women, all women. I'm interested in how we're going to show up for all women if I'm in a role like that. And anyway, that was an example of, I don't think that was done well. I think someone missed the point on that one. Like I could see by your reaction that you agree.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's something that I have run into with, again, I'm gonna say well-meaning white women friends of mine who lean in and they're learning and they're interested and they're passionate and they're angry and they're frustrated on behalf of people of color, especially women of color. The more that they learn, the more that they want to do something about it. And they step into roles like that. And I watch it and I think I understand what your intention is, but it's so confusing to have someone white in that role. I don't know that
Especially
that's
because
the
that role
intention
is
there.
meant, yeah, because especially in light of what it was. I also,
Right.
here's another example. I heard about this Latina like leadership program, let's call it a program, a Latina leadership program. And the person who was starting it was a Latinx male. And he like came to me and said, what do you think? I said, I think you should have a woman. At a minimum, you should have a Latina on your team, at a minimum. But personally, I feel you shouldn't be doing this. That's what I think. And it's just, if it's for
Yeah.
us, it should be by us. That's my opinion. So if
Why not fund someone else doing it or create the resources or provide the resources or create the space or whatever and then let someone else amplify their voice? That's so
it is a little,
strange.
it's weird. Yeah, it's strange, weird, odd. It's just, huh? That doesn't make sense to me. The math ain't mathing on that one. It just
I
doesn't.
just I keep thinking about the and mainly I was seeing this discussion on Threads. I've been really into Threads lately.
I like that too. That's how we.
Yeah, and I just the discussion of, as I said, like, the bear question and, like, white woman versus bear, and it's interesting too to then I was having this discussion with my partner and saying to him, it 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 hit me really hard, right? This expression, I'm really reflecting on this, and he said not that I didn't know it was true, I guess it isn't surprising, but it still hit me, if that makes sense, and he said, essentially, yeah, I understand as a well-meaning man, this is how I feel when we have discussions about, and of course, between him and I, we have discussions all the time about gender inequality and whatnot. But it was like, yeah, it's an interesting thing to understand and know that you share an identity with essentially the oppressor of the discussion, and also to really examine what your role is in that, in upholding that, and in maintaining those systems and structures that are in place that are causing that to be an unsafe space for X group, like in this case, right, a woman of color encountering a bear or a white woman, right? What is my role as a white woman in upholding that not being safe to encounter me in the woods? That's horrifying.
Oh,
Anyways,
and the thing is, I think all of us have some form of privilege, and we're all probably guilty in one way or another of enabling something that we are probably not even aware. So there are cases where we're aware of it, but there's some cases where we're not aware of it. But the idea is, if you know better, you do better. So if you're aware of it, you should really try and like check yourself and understand how you can do better, because we all have power and influence. And as business owners, I don't think I'm thinking so much about business owners, because that's obvious. If you own a business, you have all the power in the world. But even if you're an employee at a company, and even as a Latina woman, I'm educated. So that's a privilege that I have, and I'm very aware of it, because when I went to go live in South America and I worked with incarcerated women, I was a free woman. I had a US passport. I'm fair skinned. I speak English and Spanish. I have a college education. I have money in the bank. All those things were my privilege that I walked into that jail with every single day. And I had to be aware of how I was using that privilege and just making sure that you don't cause harm, because sometimes it's very easy to do. And so you just have to really be mindful. But I appreciate you like having this conversation. I think it's a fun conversation. To me, it's a necessary one. And it's one that I think more people should be having. And like I said, I appreciate like the curiosity and like the interest and the leaning in. And I thank you.
Thank you for coming on and sharing some of your experience. I have so many other like questions and discussion that I think we could have. I think you have to come back and we can have more conversations on the podcast, but I wanted to have a chance at two more things. Like I wanted to touch on, you mentioned to me when we first connected about the chapter that you wrote in a new book called Awareness Put Me On, and your chapter is such a compelling title, which is That Time I Ugly Cried. So
Yeah.
what is this book? And can you tell us a little bit about the chapter? And of course, we'll link to it in the description.
Yeah, so the book Awareness Put Me On, it's like a multi-author book project. So it's a compilation of essays that are written by 20 or so Black and brown authors. And everybody's talking about different things. Some people are talking about work, some people are talking about like personal challenges that they've been through, but everyone is talking about a moment in their life that like then life was never the same after that moment. And my story had something to do, it happened the summer that George Floyd was murdered. It happened on 10th. So June 19th, 2020, I had a moment, a pivotal moment where life was never the same for me again. And so I talk about that. And it's about my experience as a woman of color at work. So that's what it's related to. And I take a look back at my journey and I see some things that were the same. And I'm like, yeah, I was the only walking into those spaces. And I didn't really have anybody like me in leadership. And there was nobody really advocating for me. And I felt a little bit dismissed. And I didn't really feel like people were interested in hearing from me and what that did for me, what that did to me. And a lot of the mindset that I brought into it as a Latina, a lot of us, even though I'm not an immigrant per se, Puerto Rican people are Americans. So we're born Americans, like every single one of us. So I'm not an immigrant, but I still have a very similar immigrant experience where it's keep your head down, be grateful for what you have, don't rock the boat, just work hard type thing. And all of that, and be very likable, be very agreeable. And all those mindsets were quite problematic for work. They didn't really work for me. They weren't working. And I wasn't getting what I wanted. And I talk about being part of a sales team and how I had a great rookie year. I did better than all of my well established colleagues, but I never got credit for it. No one ever gave me a shout out. No one ever said like rookie of the year or whatever. Like it was just like low key. But if someone else had an accomplishment that was not a Latina, like I felt like they got shouted out, but I was never getting shouted out. And then I talk about, so that's all I've had a 30-year career. So that was like maybe the first 20, 25 years of my career. And then I talk about from that moment forward, what I started to do. And I offer the reader tips and I say, here's some, we can't change a system that's been around for hundreds of years. That's going to be hard to do. We can try to chip away at it, but probably not in our lifetime. So what are some things that we can do in particular as women of color to navigate these waters at work? And I offer some tips.
That's awesome. So definitely going to make sure that is linked as well, of course, with just how to connect with you in general, because I'm sure that there are people listening who want to check out not just the book because it sounds really interesting, just the premise of these moments that nothing was the same afterwards is really incredible. And then also, you just have so many great insights and perspectives in all these different areas and directions of just the experience of women of color at work. And so I know the people listening will want to connect with you, and we'll make sure that's all linked. And I love to end all of these conversations with the same question, which is, what is something, and it does not have to be work related, but it totally can be, what is something that's making you happy right now?
Oh gosh, we picked the wrong day. I just came from the doctor today, got some really bad news. So let me think. Okay, what is making me happy? Oh, I'll tell you. It's almost my birthday. My birthday's in June. So my birthday's coming. So we're right around the corner for my birthday. It's almost summertime here in New York City. The weather is starting to get really nice. I'm a big fan of the spring and summer weather. I like it warm and toasty and like going outside without a jacket and not worrying about the rain and just like wearing shorts and sandals and skirts and things like that. So that's what I'm happy about. I'm happy about the weather getting better and it almost being Gemini season.
I love that. Happy early birthday. And yeah, this will come out June 11th.
Perfect. And my birthday's June 9th. That'll be a nice.
So there you go. So happy early birthday. And at the time that this airs, happy belated birthday. Hopefully you had a great birthday. Okay. So for me, something that's making me happy right now, you'd think I would have this prepared, but I have been batch recording these. So it's so many things. I'm recording 3 just today. So it's like I had to come up with 3 things. Oh, okay. Something that's making me happy right now is my best friend who has an 18-month-old son. She recently moved out of town. She's 2 hours away from me now, or not quite, but in the middle of the desert. So I live in Arizona. So I'm in like the Phoenix metropolitan area, and she's 2 hours into the desert in a small town. And we have to make a much more like concentrated effort to see each other now. But she had a big work event in the valley in the Phoenix area. And so she spent the night at my house. We had a little girly sleepover, and it was so good to get that girl time, and also just to take us back 15 years to having sleepovers, because it's been a while since that was really like a big part of my life. So that was really fun, and we ate lots of snacks, and we watched, at the time that that we're recording this, the first half of the new Bridgerton season, which is like not really
I'm rewatching
particular.
it. I'm rewatching like from season 1 because I was going to jump into season 3 and I was like, I don't remember who these people are anymore.
Yeah. There's a lot of characters. Yeah. It's funny. I'm not like too much of a romance girl, but I watched season 1 because it was all the rage. And then I watched season 2 just because I watched season 1. Like, why not? But it was so fun to do with a girlfriend like that. It was just really fun. Yeah. So we watched the first half, and by the time this comes out, we'll be right on top of the second half of the season. So if you watch Bridgerton, you have to let me and Ani know and tell us what you think. And anyways, so I'm going to go with that. Just girl time. And
that sounds fabulous.
Friend time. So thank you so much for being here. And like I said, I will make sure everything is linked in the description and how to connect with me as well. I'm trying to do more with this podcast promotion wise for season 2 than Amanda and I were able to do for season 1, but it is very hard. It is very hard to make time for your own projects.
I have a question for you. Are you on LinkedIn?
I am on LinkedIn.
I don't know if we're connected, so we should. And will you post it on LinkedIn? Because I have a pretty decent following. I have about 12,000 followers.
Yeah, so we can definitely post on LinkedIn. So that sounds good.
Yeah, I'll definitely share it there. I'll share it on Threads and Instagram, but my biggest platform is actually LinkedIn.
Yeah, I love that. Okay, we'll definitely connect on there. I have been trying to blog these on LinkedIn to write LinkedIn articles related to the discussion.
Oh, that's great.
But blogging is tough. It's just a lot of work. The perfect world of how I want this to go. Thankfully, my business is in a season of growth right now, which is really wonderful. And after a slow holiday season, it's nice to be picking up now going into the summer. So very happy about that. But it also means my stuff always comes last, right? I think that's like the perpetual business owner plight, which is that you have the most time for your own projects when your business is slow. But when your business is picking up and it would actually serve you to be doing your own projects, it's hard. So I'm working on it. But yeah, so anyways, you can connect with me and Hady on LinkedIn, and you can also connect with me a little bit on Instagram. But honestly, come hang out with us on Threads. The discussion on Threads is so good. It's such better discussion than on Instagram. Like so come and follow us over there. And thank you so much for listening, and I will see you next week.
All right. Thanks, Sarah.